Welcome to the Storycraft Cafe. Come in, grab a cup of your favorite beverage, and get ready to join the storytelling conversation. Storycraft Cafe is brought to you by Dabble, the ultimate cloud-based fiction writing software. Here we're going to bring together storytellers from all walks to encourage and empower you to craft your best story.
Hello everyone, my name is Grace and I'm the community manager here at the Storycraft Cafe. If you have not already joined us in the cafe, I would like to personally invite you to our community. We have so many awesome things going on this month. We have totally revamped our writing group program to include a writing group marketplace where you can browse open writing groups or decide to create your own. At the beginning of the month, we launched the 500 Club, which is an exclusive accountability group that challenges you to write 500 words a day over a 2-week or a month-long commitment. Finally, this month we launched weekly communal word sprints that are open to all crafters. As of this moment, we have 4 sprints happening per week, and we are cranking out words. If you're interested in joining our community, you can find us online at storycraft.cafe. That's STORYCRAFT.CAFE. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy this episode.
It's Monday, and that means once again it's time to join us here in the Storycraft Cafe for another great author interview. Today we have Helene Wecker, who talks to us about writing modern fantasy built on ancient myths. This is a fascinating conversation. I know you're going to love it. Before we get over to Helene, though, let's listen to Melissa De La Cruz talk about writing fantasy for a YA audience.
I think, you have to, since I am a YA writer, I do like to write about teenagers and about that time in your life when you're discovering things and you're trying to figure out who you are and what you want to do, but the world is still so new and open and your whole life is in front of you. And then when you transfer that to the fantasy world, it feels very natural because so much, even with Game of Thrones, when it starts with the Starks, they're all quite young. I think Jon Snow was maybe like 14 or 15 when he sent to the wall. So it does feel natural to start at that point in the characters' lives. Even with Lord of the Rings, with Frodo and his friends, they felt, young to me, that they were young men, kind of just starting on their lives. And it is about, okay, there's magic, there's, danger, but there's also growing up. So it feels, it almost feels like fantasy is for a YA reader. Because I read those books when I was a teenager. They just felt really natural. I feel like this whole kind of new kind of marketing sections we've been placed into, like YA is so big. But, as James Patterson said, a lot of books are for 9 years old to 90. Once you can read, once you can comprehend, there's a lot of books out there. So I think there is that general reader for fantasy that you don't have to just be 15 or 13. You can be 50 and still enjoy it.
Today, I'm super excited to have Helene Wecker on the show with me. She has a fantastic new book. It's not exactly new, but it is newly released in paperback. It's called The Hidden Palace, a novel of the Golem and Jinni. And what a fun book. What a lush, deep, immersive experience this book was. And I can't wait for everyone to pick up their copy of it. Welcome to the show, Helene.
Well, thank you so much, Hank. Thank you for having me on, and thank you for your kind words.
Absolutely. Helene, we have a couple of questions that we vary when we start the show, and great ways to start conversation. What is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, gosh. My first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller, I think is sort of tied up with the first book that I really fell in love with, which was a book called Myths and Enchantment Tales. And I don't think it's still around. It was one of these, I think it was either, British. It was like written probably like the 30s or 40s. It was this boulderized selection of Greek and Roman myths for children that left out all the dirty and gory bits. And it was this, the book itself was this sort of thin hardcover with these absolutely beautiful Art Deco illustrations. And I memorized that thing. I read it over and over again. And it wasn't until much later, till I was an adult, that I realized that I think that book did a lot of sort of the map making for me of storytelling. And it just got sort of sunk into my DNA. And I ended up going from there and falling in love with a lot of the sort of sci-fi and fantasy that reproduced, I think, a lot of the structure of those myths, those really old, sort of like the DNA, gets fed into tales as you go on, and tales of the impossible or the improbable or the fantastic. And so I ended up, I think probably like my first stories that I wrote were really bad fan fiction of Star Trek and Doctor Who and a lot of the sort of going out and exploring and finding difference sort of stories. I think. Yeah, it all got tied up together, and I remember just reading that book over and over, and then talking to my parents about it, or my brother, and seeing and then when you would people would use references to the Greek myths, like a Herculean struggle or something like that, I'd be like, oh, I know who that is. You see statues of Atlas holding the globe, and it felt like secret knowledge. It felt like I was seeing bits of it all over. So I think that all just sort of tied together.
I love that. So having this early experience with, these old myths, and you start kind of seeing how a lot of these things, have filtered into our modern understandings of things. Were you interested in myths from all over the world? What was it that when you finally decided to write this story, what was it about the Golem and the Jinni that really captured your imagination?
So, I think, you said, were you interested in myths from all over the world? I think as I discovered them, I got interested in them. But, there wasn't, I'm a child of the 80s. And unfortunately, we did not have like the push toward, multicultural storytelling as much in my, growing up as we do today. So when I found them, as I grew up, I was interested in them. But it wasn't, I think the Greek and Roman myths were basically as diverse as my storytelling got, back in the 80s, unfortunately. But, as I got older, and, someone asked me recently, what was your first story of a golem? When did you first learn about golems? And, I grew up Jewish in the Midwest, but I never really absorbed all of the legends. I didn't have family that told me, the tales. I had, some, at Sunday school or wherever, I got a few like Isaac Bashevis Singer stories, or Shalom Aleichem stories, and the stuff that had been sort of boiled down for kids, maybe a few things. But golems had always sort of been around, but I didn't know where they I don't know where they came from. My grandparents didn't tell me. They left all that stuff behind in the old country. That wasn't something that that they talked to me about, at least. And I think, honestly, like, my first Golem stories were like the sci-fi retellings of them. There's that X-Files episode that had a golem in it. And there was a friend of mine who's a Jewish fantasy writer who I know actually from college. She wrote a golem story that was the first female golem I'd ever seen. Her name's Naomi Kritzer. And so, but I never read like, He, She, and It. I never read I blank on everyone's names. The Puttermesser Papers by Cynthia Ozick. All of those like came later. So it was more like this idea of golems that sort of existed out there in the ether that I didn't have like a really firm hold on until I started doing the research and writing as part of this. And for Djinn, it was really the same. I had the Americanized, westernized, Aladdin and 1001 Nights, and I Dream of Jinni and all of that. And so I knew enough to know that was what the West had done to these stories to some extent. And so when I started working on the Golem and the Jinni, I made a very deliberate effort to go and find the original, I mean, it's in the Quran. Jinn are in the Quran. So when you say the original, it's like you're going all the way back. Like, but to educate myself as much as I could within reason about different versions of the Djinn story and the Djinn myth, and which is quite an ordeal because they are so diverse and pervasive throughout the Muslim and Middle Eastern world. So yeah, a lot of, I think I spent a lot of my life as a sponge, just sort of soaking up random stuff. But then once I got to the job of actually deliberately sitting down and doing the research, that was like a whole other education.
So I think a lot of people's introduction to fantasy and a lot of what they have been immersed in is kind of Middle Ages European culture. That's what a lot of fantasy involves. Now, the Golem goes back to Jewish folklore, and the Jinni goes back to Muslim folklore. First off, when you really got excited about these characters, these kind of archetypes, where did you go to really dig into to kind of shed some of that Western influence that had been kind of crept into these story archetypes, and to really dig into who they traditionally were and the rich history that comes with them?
It's hard. I know that as a Western woman, an American woman who does not read or speak Arabic, there's only so much I can get to the original because it is still going to be filtered into English and through various translators, many of whom were deeply problematic in their own ways. But I went online and found a lot of scholarly articles from like the early 1900s of sort of explorers, basically when sociology and cultural studies started to actually become a thing, and when people were starting to actually take non-Western cultures seriously to some extent, not as like we're going to go and tell them how silly they are, but we're going to go and actually write down what people are saying, and then see if we can figure out like a cosmology behind it, or how this relates to their larger society. So there's one guy who went to all the little villages in Lebanon on what was then sort of the region of Lebanon and is now like the country of Lebanon, and wrote down all of the folklore. You would just like sort of walk around the town and find out, what people, oh, don't go to that well, that's where the Djinn are. Okay, well, how do you know? And well, because, strange things happen there and all that sort of local lore, and sayings and superstitions and, okay, why do you, blue beads and iron beads, why do you tie those around your baby's necks? It's to keep them safe. It's, like the evil eye. And so I, just all the little, some of it, just being like the day-to-day details, that, the things like that we don't even sometimes think about in our culture anymore, like putting a horseshoe over your door. That's still, you can still see that even if it's not like a real horseshoe. There's like an architectural feature. Will there be like a little arch over a door? Well, that's, to keep it. Originally that was, it was because it was iron, and that was what kept the fairies out. And going back to Western and British Isles and all of that. And what's really fascinating to me is that both the West and the East have this same thing about iron, that Djinn are allergic, sort of quote unquote to iron. It's like their kryptonite. And so I would start to see how there's like these little connections between. It's like, oh, well, this is similar already. This is stuff that I kind of already know, and it's that same root of like the fairy world and the Djinn world being like representative of nature and the uncontrollable, and then having humanity being represented by iron and progress and machinery, and that's what's beating back the savage of savage nature. And so when you start to see that stuff, it's like, oh, okay, well, this isn't so different, and I can start to relate this through those little details and make it into something that feels sort of woven through the fabric of the characters' lives.
So when we're dealing with Jewish culture and Muslim culture, we're talking about cultures that originally were very close geographically, and that share a lot of cultural touch points. A lot of the culture kind of overlaps between the two. Have you seen in your research and your kind of familiarizing yourself with these concepts, with these characters, has there been much overlap in the past in genies and golems that kind of occupy the same space and occupy the same stories?
Well, not on the golem side. A lot of the golem myth comes specifically from Middle Ages European Judaism,
Gotcha.
Jewish culture. And so, and a lot, in fact, of the stories that we now look at as like the most classic golem stories of the Middle Ages are actually more modern inventions from like the 1800s that were said to be the, it's like, this is an old tale. This is an old Middle Ages tale. Well, no, you just sort of invented it about, 20 minutes ago. And so that, if you really dig into the scholarship of it, you can see that, like, apparently, because I'm no scholar, but what I've read is that, a lot of the stuff, it's like, some of it's all other stuff that had the serial numbers filed off and got rewritten. And the 1001 Nights is exactly the same thing. But the thing that is really cool that I really wish that I could have figured out a way to put into this, into the second book that I haven't, that I didn't, and I'm still sort of banking for later, is how much Djinn were also a part of just sort of the fabric of Jewish Middle Eastern life, because it is like the regional myth, and it gets worked into Jewish stories from the Middle East, from basically the Jews who stuck around and never who were either like went to Spain and became Marranos, or who like stayed in Yemen and various other countries, and Iran and Jordanian Jews and all of those, and Iraqi Jews. this was all, Djinn were always part of their life. And I had a woman who was an Iranian Jew, I think, came up to me at a reading once, and she would tell me about how her grandmother would be, was known for her dancing. And at weddings, she would start to dance, and then she would get she would just start spinning in circles and get, basically into a trance. And other people would say, oh, the Djinn are in her now. And it's like, that of course, it was just sort of like eye-opening to me. Of course, that would be a part of Jewish life in the Middle East, because it's basically, the local folk, folk stories, folk religion that gets absorbed into the codified religion, and it ends up being in that sort of overlap between mythology and religion and folklore, and there's all that just sort of mushed together that becomes just sort of part of the fabric of everyone's lives. And so I really need to figure out a way to get that into a book at some point, because I just think it's so fascinating.
So you've got these mythical creatures that you've become fascinated with, and you see the interconnection and the interplay that could happen between them. Then you take those characters and you bring them to America, and in the past, but not the ancient past. A past that our parents and grandparents could have experienced. What was that initial spark of an idea? Hey, I could take these characters, I could bring them to the Western world, to America, in a semi-modern setting, and then, see what hilarity ensues.
Yeah, and that is basically what happened. I really sort of backed my way into it. When I think about how it happened, it was sort of, there wasn't a lot of deliberation about it. It was almost like this thought experiment that turned into a book. Because what happened was that I was at Columbia, and Columbia University in New York. I was getting my master's in creative writing, and I was writing these very real, sort of like the M.F.A. Carver-esque short story, very realist, lots of small emotional epiphanies sort of stories that were taken from real life stories that were from my husband's family and my family. Me growing up Jewish in suburban Chicago, him growing up Arab American and 45 minutes away from me. And we didn't meet till college, but our families' histories of immigration to the U.S. and sort of the psychological effects that it has on the immigrants and then their children, and growing up basically in white bread suburbia, had always resonated with me, like that our families were so close in so many ways. Even though when you look at Jewish and Arab American, and you think about headlines and in the Middle East, and you think, well, you should be sort of like knocking heads, right? And it's like, well, no, because this is in the context of growing up watching the same cartoons in the 80s, and then going right to and having the same sort of experiences of feeling just sort of weird and other, and growing up sort of with this cultural history, this family history of like an emotional resonance with a place that you've possibly never even seen, because that's where your family is from, but it's not where you're from. So I was working on these stories, and the problem that I was having was that they were not working very well. They just were not very good. And I was really pissed off about it, because, it's that feeling of like, I'm not good enough yet. I'm not a good enough writer yet. I want to be better than this. And so I was talking about it to a friend of mine who was in the class with me, and she basically at one point turned to me and said, Helene, why are you doing this? Why are you writing these very, subtle, emotional, realist tales when I know what a nerd you are? I've been to your apartment and I've seen your bookshelf and you're always talking in class about all of, the uses of the fantastical and literary fiction and this and that. And so why aren't you doing that? Because that's where your heart is. And I honestly hadn't, to this day, I'm like, why didn't I do that? I have no idea why. And I think I was just too intimidated by going to Columbia. And it was like, well, I can't be writing that stuff here, and it wasn't like anyone told me that. It was something I, sort of put on myself without even realizing. So I basically like wandered home to my apartment and sat there as like, okay, so what if I do that? What if instead of like the Jewish girl and American and Arab American boy who'd been like sort of like threading through these stories, okay, we're going to Neil Gaiman this. What if we make them a girl golem and a boy genie? And okay, well, I could just sort of see them. Just standing there. As soon as I said that, I was like, okay, well, there you guys are. It was like this tall woman who looked sort of shy and unsure of herself, and this equally tall man who had this sort of bad boy look around to him. And I was like, okay, so where are you guys? What do I do with you? And because I think because I was thinking about it in terms of like folklore and immigration together, that sort of suggested an Ellis Island sort of setting to me. So I was like, okay, well, I'll put you in Manhattan at the turn of the 20th century, and you're just going to sort of wander around until you find each other. And so I sat down and wrote that day, like the first 12 pages of what would later become the Golem and the Genie. But I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea about, 20th century, early turn of the 20th century American life. I was just sort of like skimming over the details because I didn't know what they were. I'm like, how do people live? What do you eat? How do you know what time it is if, there aren't like people don't have wristwatches yet? So I'll just leave that stuff out for now. So I brought it, I wrote about a dozen pages and I brought it to a workshop and everyone, read it and got back to me and said, well, this is the most interesting thing you've shown us so far. So thank you for that. This is better than the other stuff. But this isn't a short story. This is a novel and we think you should know. And I did not believe them at first. I was like, no, this is just like a fun short story that I'm going to get out of my system. And then I'm going to go back to, the real work. And then the story, it was like, it got longer and longer and longer. And it felt like there was just more and more that I wanted these characters to do. And the story itself started to get interesting in those details that I didn't know yet. It was like, okay, how do you actually go about disguising yourself as a human in 1899 New York? How do you get an apartment? How do you, what do you do? How do you get around town? What sort of job would you have if you're a golem? If you're like a girl golem who, you can't exactly go down to the docks and say, hey, I'd like to be a stevedore and like haul things around all day because you're a woman. So you have to figure out how to do something that, is going to take that physical urge of like being a creature that's made for work, and translate, but also like do something that's like women are allowed to do. So I made her into a baker, and then I put her in a bakery, and now I've got this whole world of the Lower East Side with like this popular bakery that she's seeing everyone come in and out. Now I have to read about the Lower East Side. So everything just sort of unfolded bit by bit and turned into this giant world that I got very invested in and wanted to show everyone. And so this thing that I thought, and then over on the Jinni side too, it's like, well, okay, what Arab Americans are in America in 1899? And I started to do the research and I learned, okay, so it's the Lebanese and it's mostly Christian. It's almost exclusively Christian just because of the demographics and who's who has enough English to come to America and actually get a job? Well, it's going to be the Lebanese Christians who learned English from the missionaries who came and, would be at a church for a few years and teach someone enough English to get by and then give them a letter of introduction. And then they could go to America and make a living. And so now I'm reading memoirs of Lebanese Christians who came to America at the turn of the 20th century. And I'm reading about this community that formed at the southern tip of Manhattan that was called Little Syria. And so, the same thing's going over on that side. And so this short story that I thought I was writing turned into a book that took 7 years in the end to research, write, and get out into the world. And it really just sort of walked backwards into the whole thing.
It never ceases to amaze me, the power of story to break down barriers and to extend the olive branch in sort of a way that, when you think about disparate cultures and people like you alluded to earlier, the idea that you should be knocking heads with, but when we couch that in story and we allow the humanity to show that, and humanity is an interesting way to describe these characters because they are not human, but they do reflect our humanity in their character development. What was that like writing these characters and realizing kind of the importance that you were that they were taking on, whether you maybe intended for them to or not? But was there ever a realization, that these characters are gonna grow bigger than I maybe initially intended for them to, or they were going to have importance that maybe I didn't first, give that intent to?
It's a really good question, and it did actually happen that way, because at first I had no idea who these two were. And because I had, gotten into the idea of the book the way that I did, they at first were little more than stand-ins for me and my husband. They were sort of these vessels of well, you're going to be the metaphor, the figurehead, whatever. But then as I got into the details of the story and I started to think through the day-to-day of, okay, so what are they going to do with their lives? That was when they started to develop their own personalities and their own considerations, many of which came directly from their natures as these inhuman creatures who are being forced into human acting lives. And what are they going to strain against? What is going to drive them absolutely crazy? And what is going to, and then once they meet up, I sort of created them as they took on their own personalities. I was like, okay, well, if I'm going to be shaping you guys, let's look at you almost as like opposites in some way. Where the golem, her whole purpose, what she's built for is servitude, and she's really not comfortable unless she's helping someone, unless she's being of use. That is like her calling, her ultimate goal is to be of use. That is what she feels she is there for. And the genie is the exact opposite. He's a free spirit. He very, very usually literally. I've trapped him in human form for the purpose of the book. But he's deeply resentful of the fact that he is now stuck in this human world, that he was, he was brought over basically by accident, and did not ask for any of this. But he's like, well, I guess if I'm here, I need to make the most of it, but I'm not exactly going to be happy about it. So when these two meet, feels he has no obligation to anyone or anything. Human rules, things like monogamy and having to wear clothing and things like that just piss him off. So when these two get together, they, I was able to design them to react to each other, where it was like, these two are going to be like oil and water. And they are going to do nothing but argue about it. But the overarching thing that is going to ally them and keep them together is that they are the only ones who know what the other one is going through. It's sort of this very contentious society of two, where they are sitting outside humanity and observing it and, interacting with it in their own, very different ways, but they have this common conversation because of their position. And I do get to sort of look at humanity through them, which was not my intent at the beginning, but pretty quickly. I mean, I guess it sort of makes sense that if you take two characters who aren't human and you put them in the middle of 1899 New York society, what you're going to get is a lot of philosophy. You're going to get a lot of, why the hell are they doing what they're doing? And, what is it about humans that drives us crazy? And that gets pretty deep into human nature and societal rules and stuff like that and different perspectives on it. So I've had people ask me, why did you put so much philosophy in these books about monsters? And I was like, it just sort of came with them. they just sort of started talking and this was what they talked about, because this was their common experience, was looking at humans and from a position of from the edge, from the outside. And I guess that is what philosophy is to some extent, as much as anyone can remove themselves from humanity in order to look at it. So that it was just sort of, a thing that developed along with the book.
The Hidden Palace is book 2 for these characters. Is there more life for these characters going forward?
I hope so. I am working on book 3 not as we speak, but book 3 is currently open on my computer. It is right now a massive research and notes that don't make a lot of, well, hopefully they make sense, but there isn't. It's a skeleton right now with pieces missing, and I'm sort of slowly building it. And so, I don't know past book 3 what may or may not happen, but part of the fun of these characters is that they are, essentially in some way immortal. And so I've had people say to me, you could bring these up into the modern world if you wanted to. You could just write them straight through to our times. And I was like, yeah, I could. It would be sort of more and more work as I went on to be like, okay, how are they pretending to, have they sort of faked their own deaths and come back as their own children, because they are living in a world that, will notice if you don't age and if you don't eat. And so that is part of the stuff they have to pretend to do. I think there's more life in them. I think there's a lot more they can do.
Well, if you decide to write them through to modern history, I am here for it. I'm just tell you. The Hidden Palace is available everywhere now in the original hardcover release and now in paperback, as well as the Golem and the Jinni, the first book in the series. Go grab them both. You will not be disappointed, I promise. Helene, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you're up to, where can they find you online?
They can find me at HeleneWecker.com. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. And I can't remember exactly if it's Helene Wecker or Wecker H, but I am the only Helene Wecker out there. So just search on me and you'll find me.
Great. We will put links to those places in the show notes to make it easy for folks to find you. I love this book. I know everyone else will. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
you.